This is Joe with US Sander, and in this video I'm going to be showing you how to replace bearings on a Super 7 edger. While it's running, you want to look inside here and see what you see for sparking. You should see a faint blue line where the brushes contact the armature. If you're seeing sparks carrying around that armature, then that's something that's going to need to be addressed. The other thing we want to watch for is as it slows down, you want to watch your brushes. You can also turn it over by hand and watch and see if you have any up and down movement in the brushes. If you do, then that armature needs to be turned. The next thing we want to check before we take the top cover off is make sure that there is no play in the top bearing. Occasionally on these, what will happen is the bearing will start to seize up and it'll wear the housing. So you want to make sure everything's unplugged. Reach inside here and we want to push the armature in either direction. If you can feel any movement, then that top housing is worn and needs to be addressed. Always make sure to tip your edger back before you plug it in, because these switches have a tendency of sticking and we don't want it to take off. The other thing we want to check for is make sure that our threads in this shaft are still good. In this case, we have a pretty big stack of sandpaper on here. That's usually an indicator that the bolt is not threading in all the way. What happens is abrasive from the sandpaper tends to build up inside that hole, so you need to clean that out with a 5/16 drill bit and a 3/8 tap. You want to take the 5/16 drill bit on your drill and drill out that abrasive. Then use compressed air to blow it out. Next, you want to use a 3/8 tap to clear the threads. Be sure that the tap you use for this is only used for cleaning this, because the abrasive that builds up in there will damage the tap, so you will not be able to use it for other purposes. Once you've got that cleaned out, you want to take a bolt and make sure that it threads in and doesn't have a lot of play. If there's a lot of play in there, that means the shaft itself is worn and it will strip out the threads on the bolt. The other thing we need to do is make sure that it's going to thread in far enough. In this case, I can't get it to thread in as far as it needs to tighten the paper. That's because the abrasive and rust has built up in there and my tap is not sharp enough to cut through that without wearing the tap. So we're going to go ahead and replace that shaft. To remove the pad, we want to take this grease plug out. Put a punch into the gear. You'll have to turn it over until you find the hole in the gear. And if you have a pad wrench, you want to use that. If you don't, use a punch in the hole in the pad and use a whack with a hammer to break it loose. With the pad off, we remove the 4 screws to hold this roller guard in place. These 3 screws that hold the bottom plate need to be removed. Be careful you don't lose the rubber washers. You don't want to pry on this plate to remove it. You have to pull on this shaft. Usually the best thing to do that is a slide hammer if you have access to that. If not, use a bar across here and a bolt that threads in there to pull it out. With this removed, we want to clean the grease out of here. Be careful you don't lose this spring washer inside there. Once you've cleaned the grease out, you want to remove this bottom gear. It is left-hand thread. You'll need a 9/16 open-end wrench to loosen that up. You want to stick something into the fan to hold it, and you need to turn it clockwise to loosen. Now, if you happen to have one of these pin sockets, it can be very handy for this. Unfortunately, the diameter of these is too big for it to be able to actually make a full turn while it's attached to this. But if you just put that pin socket on there, turn it all the way to the left, and then stick a wedge into your fan and turn it right as far as it'll go. Then you need to turn the whole armature back to the left. And once you get it started, you can usually just hold that socket on it and turn the fan to unthread it. Because that gear is threaded on, that's why when we removed the pad, we needed to make sure that we stuck a pin through the grease hole and into our gear, because otherwise, when we tried to loosen that pad, if we just held the armature, what would happen is that gear would loosen up instead of the pad loosening up. Now, to remove our top end, we want to take this light cover off. You'll have to remove your light bulb. And then remove this front screw. There's also 2 screws in the back corners. You'll need a 3/16 Allen wrench to remove those screws. Before we pull this top cover off, we want to take the brushes out because we don't want them to push in and fall on the inside. They become very difficult to pull back out when that happens. Your brush spring clip. On the new style, it'll be this brass clip. You have to push it in and then over sideways towards the brush and let it back out. There are a total of 4 of these. 2 there, and then you have an additional 2 under these cover plates. The one behind the switch can be tricky to get out because of the wires. If need be, you can use a pair of long nose pliers to reach in there and pull that out. Now, this top cover will usually come off without too much difficulty. If you have any trouble with it, you can usually twist it enough to get a pry bar between the dust pipe and the cover and pry up on it. Inside here, there is a spring washer held in place with some grease. Make sure that doesn't fall out. We don't want that to end up getting jammed into your motor. Now we can take the armature out. There's no retainers left on it. It's just a tight fit in the bearing, so you want to use a soft punch to drive on the end of the shaft. Now there's a small spacer inside the seal that goes back on the armature. Then this seal needs to be removed. Under the seal we have a retainer clip. With that off, we can flip this upside down and drive the bearing out. To change the bearings in this plate, you have a couple different options. If you have a press, you can support the gear and press on the shaft and press it out of both the outer bearing and the gear. You don't want to support this bearing because there is a key in the shaft that'll catch on the race of this bearing and you won't be able to press it out. Oftentimes you can separate the plate from the gear pretty easily with a couple of pry bars. You just have to be careful when doing that not to damage the plate. You want to put your pry bars in as far as you can and you want to pull back towards you. If you push down, you'll be putting pressure on the outside edge of this plate, which will bend and break it. But as long as you're pulling back towards you, you'll be pulling on the inner edge of the plate and it won't do it any damage. If you do run into one that's rusted in place, then you don't want to pry too hard. You better use a press. Now that we have the grease cleaned off of these parts, we're going to change the bearings. There is a retainer that holds this bearing in the plate. We're going to need to pull that. And then we can press this bearing out. Install a new 6203 bearing in that plate. Reinstall that retainer. Your gear will need the shaft and bearing pressed out together. If you're reusing your old shaft, you will need to pull the key out of it. Usually the most effective way to do that is using a pair of side cut pliers to grip the key and then pry them out. In this case, we're replacing the shaft, so we're just going to discard it the way it is. Our new shaft comes with a new key. Take your 6203 bearing. You'll have to press it shaft into the bearing before we put the key in. Usually the most effective way of putting that key in is get it started by hand and then use the press or a vise to force it in. If you can't get it started, take a small file and file a little bit of a chamfer to get that key started. Next, we need to press the shaft into the gear. The gear is flush with the hub on one side and the hub sticks out on the other. You want to make sure that that long side of the hub faces down and press your shaft through that way. You'll have to line it up as close as you can with the keyway in the gear by eye. You just want to watch it as you press it in, make sure that that is in alignment, because if you have it a little bit off, then you'll have to press it back and turn it, you don't want to force it through. It'll cut that keyway wider, and then your gear will not be on the shaft as tight as it should be. Now we can press these two together. And this bottom end is ready to be put back on. On our armature, removing this bearing can be difficult at times. Usually you can get a pry bar between the bearing and the top of the armature. You want to be careful when you do this because we don't want to damage any of these copper bars. So we want to pry against the inside of the armature, not the outside. Now we take a new 6202 bearing and press that onto the top of this armature. Now we take our bottom housing. We want to set it on the bench so that the wheels stick over the edge. We don't want to put this bearing in the press because the bottom of this edger is tapered, and so the bearing will want to go crooked if you try to use a press. Instead, we just put this on and use a hammer to gently tap it in. Now we reinstall this clip ring. Put your seal in with the spring side facing down. Next, you want to put your spacer back in that seal. Drop your armature down through. A lot of times these gaskets between the fan plate and the top housing are shrunk. You want to replace that if it's too small, otherwise it will get caught in the fan and make quite a bit of a rattle. Before we put this top housing back on, we want to change the brushes. Use a pair of long nose pliers to grab the wire and pull down, and then you can pull your brush out. To put our new brush in, we want to take the wire end with our pliers and put it back on that connector. Then your wire will be at the bottom. Just push your brush in. You don't want to push it in all the way. Just get it started. With our new gasket in place on here, make sure all of our brushes are not sticking through. Double check that your spring washer is still inside this housing. And this should set down over top. And we can reinstall the screws. Before we go any further, we want to make sure that this turns over freely. We can reach inside here and turn the fan. In this case, it turns without any resistance. It's best to put this gear back on before we run the edger. Again, you can use the pin socket or an open-end wrench. And to tighten it down, you want to turn your socket as far as you can go clockwise, then put a wedge in the fan, repeat as needed until it's snug. With that done, we're going to put our brush springs back in. You want to check all your brush springs and make sure that they are not cracked or damaged. It should roll up all the way to the rivet. If it's stuck back further, or you unroll it and you see a spot where it's kinked, you want to replace it. We can push this in, and then we want to push it away from the brush, and it'll click into place. For the one behind the switch, you're going to want to grab this ear with a pair of pliers and install it that way. For safety purposes, we want to make sure that this switch is installed before we plug this in. Double check that you don't have any wires that are contacting the armature in any way. Sometimes the wires are too long and they will end up bending into the armature. Make sure if that happens, you pull them out and tuck them away where they will not contact anything moving. Before we put the bottom end together, we're going to seat the brushes. We want to make sure that we can get these brushes seated properly, because if we have to take this back apart to repair the armature, we don't want the bottom end together. To seat the brushes, what I'm going to do is lightly run this brush seating stone across the face of the armature while it's running. This will leave a small deposit of this fine abrasive, which will wear the brushes slightly until they match the shape of the armature. You could hear as I did that, the speed of the edger increased as the brush is seated. You want to watch and see your sparking inside that edger. Usually you'll see a faint blue line where the brushes contact the armature. If you're seeing blue carrying around the armature, then that is going to need attention. Usually that means the armature needs to be turned or rewound. Make sure you unplug the edger. Flip it over. Be sure to reinstall your spring washer. The ears that bend upward, those need to be facing towards the bearing, and the flat side goes into the housing. Now we take and put new grease in here. The grease that came out of this was a very thick grease that, if you noticed, was not really on the gear surfaces like it should be. We recommend using our edger grease, which is a thinner grease, and will actually run back into the bearings. When you get that grease from us, it'll typically be in a bottle. I have it here in a pump for my convenience because we do a lot of these edgers. Usually you want to put the grease around the gear and into the wells, as well as putting a bit of grease on your lower gear. You're going to use most of the bottle of grease to do this. On your bottom plate, there is one spot that has a divot. That is for clearance for this gear. Make sure you line it up. If it's not lined up, then you will end up with this gear rubbing against the housing. Drop that in, line up your screws. You want to start these screws, make sure the rubber washers are in place. Do not use these screws to pull this plate into place. That will end up bending the plate because your main resistance is from this shaft and these screws are on the outside edge. You can take a soft face hammer and gently tap this into place. Once it's seated, then you can tighten your screws. Now we want to make sure it still turns over freely. You're going to have some more resistance than what you had before because now there is grease and gears, but you should be able to turn it over by hand. Now we can put this bottom plate in. Now with the roller guard and retainer in place, we can put the pad back on. In some cases, you'll have fiber washers that were between your pad and the bearing. You don't want to reuse those. If you do want to use one of those, just stick one new fiber washer in here, but you won't need that with a new pad. If it's an aluminum pad, you no longer need those fiber washers. It's only the old steel pads that needed those. You want to thread that pad on until it's snug and then be sure to tighten it further with a wrench. You want to make sure you put your paper retainer screw and washer in place before we run this edger. Otherwise, when we shut it off, this pad may unthread itself. Be sure that your vent hole in your grease plug is clear. Otherwise, you'll have any excess grease will leak out the bottom of the edger. Reinstall your grease plug. Now we can adjust this edger. When you put a new pad on one of these edgers, a good starting point is putting 3/4 under each of these corners. That'll get you pretty close. On a B2, that's going to be a dime and a nickel. The other thing that you can do is you can look underneath and you'll be able to see roughly where the pad is contacting. In this case, we can see it's contacting quite a bit more on this side than on this side, so we want to level that off. To adjust these, you'll need to use a pair of pliers to loosen this nut and then thread this entire assembly. So what we're going to do is we're going to loosen this up and then thread this until we are centered. That's about level side to side. Then we want to look underneath it and see how much is contacting. In this case, it's pretty close to flat from what we can see, but the only way to tell for sure is by actually running this against sandpaper. You typically want your pad to be contacting somewhere between 2 bars and 3 bars. If you get into 4 or 5 bars, you'll be cutting very flat, which can leave a lot of swirl marks from this smaller radius here. So most people prefer to keep it between 2 and 3, and then if you do want it to sand flatter, you can use a backup pad between your sandpaper and this rubber pad. You want to take a little bit of chalk or crayon and put it on this pad so that you have an indication of where you're contacting. If you put several lines across the pad, then when you sand it down a little bit, you'll be able to tell how far back it's contacting by where the chalk is rubbed off and where it's not. Now that we have it rough adjusted, we're going to run it against the sandpapers very lightly. This is a 60 grit sandpaper. You want to use 50 or 60 grit. 80 grit's about the finest you ever want to use. Anything finer than that will tend to just heat up your rubber and not actually sand it. We don't want to put the full weight of the edger against the pad because that'll sand it too much and make it heat up too much. You only want to run it for about 30 seconds maximum, and then you want to let it cool down. If this rubber overheats, it'll get sticky, and then you won't be able to get it to dress properly. So if you look at where we marked this with chalk, you can see that this is contacting only on this very outside edge. So we wanted to cut a little bit flatter than that. What we need to do is we need to adjust our wheels to lower the back of the edger. To do that, we're going to turn each of these counterclockwise half a turn. Now we're going to run it again and see how it does. Now it's down to where it's contacting more where we want it to. So this edger is all set. If you prefer your edger to cut further in or further out, all that is adjusting both wheels equally, either out or in, depending on which direction you're trying to go. If it's cutting too much on one side and you want it more towards the center, then you want to tighten the wheel on the right side will make it cut closer to the left in the front. Loosen the wheel on the right side and it'll make it cut towards the right in the front. And you can do the same with the left wheel, depending on whether you're trying to just adjust the level or you want it to cut flatter or steeper.